The Yellow Peril is back! The US government is escalating its Cold War with China in the form of a trade war. The White House says it's about China's economic abuses and theft of intellectual property, but that's a lie. It's actually about the US trying to contain China's rise as an economic and technological powerhouse. It's all to maintain US dominance over the world economy. This was gonna happen with or without Trump, but it turns out Trump is a great vehicle for it, since he's making xenophobia great again.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country.
He's got anti-China extremists as advisors. People like Peter Navarro, the director of the White House National Trade Council, who produced an entire documentary film called Death by China, which argues that China is poisoning America and destroying its economy. And Kyron Skinner, Trump's director of policy planning at the State Department. She promotes a bigoted clash of civilizations narrative.
When we think about the Soviet Union and that competition, in a way, it was a fight within the Western family. Karl Marx was a German Jew who developed a philosophy that was really within the larger body of political thought. That's not really possible with China. This is a fight with a really different civilization and a different ideology. It's also striking that's the first time that we will have a great power competitor that is not Caucasian.
I do want to press you on that. I mean, the United States is not all Caucasians.
I think it's extremely relevant because the foreign policy establishment is so narrowly defined. It's more homogenous.
But you're
black. You are.
America's weapon of choice is tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imports or exports that's meant to protect companies in your country from foreign competition. Trump imposed higher tariffs on at least $200 billion of Chinese goods, from tech to automobiles, food ingredients, steel, bike parts, and more. And he's threatening to go further, all to hinder the Chinese economy, particularly its tech sector. China has responded with tariffs on the US. This tariff war is actually hurting the US because the price trickles down to American businesses and consumers.
Trump's tariffs on imported steel, essentially a 25% tax, ended up raising the price of American steel too.
We just have to pass it along to the customer. Our customer has to pass it along to their customer, and so on down the chain.
Our sales to China have gone down, and our raw materials from China have increased in cost.
How big of a problem is that for you?
Several $1 million of profit lost in a year.
Okay.
The US foreign policy blob agrees with Trump's hawkishness. They accuse China of intellectual property theft and of shielding Chinese companies from foreign competition by pumping them full of subsidies. But subsidies are totally normal, especially for developing economies. The US heavily subsidizes its own industries and has violated WTO rules, like in the case of Boeing, which was getting illegal subsidies from the US government in breach of global trade rules. Global trade rules created by the US. The US has also sanctioned Chinese tech giants it feels threatened by, most notoriously Huawei, whose CFO was arrested on US orders in Canada in an unprecedented move. Trump put Huawei on the so-called entity list, forbidding US companies from trading with it based on unproven claims that the company was skirting sanctions against Iran and is beholden to the Chinese government. You could be forgiven for assuming that Chinese tech giants are in bed with the Chinese government, given that American tech giants like Google, Facebook, and Amazon have done the bidding of the US national security state. So why is the US doing this? Huawei is the world's leading provider of networking equipment. Its smartphone is a bestseller outside the US, and European countries were considering Huawei-based infrastructure for their 5G wireless networks. 5G is the next generation of wireless technology. China is way ahead of the US and will likely be the world leader in 5G, which would be a huge economic and technological loss for the US and its companies. So the US response has been to try to game the system by sabotaging Huawei with sanctions. But it's the accusation of intellectual property theft that's been central to US complaints about China. That and fear-mongering about China's supposed expansion in the South China Sea. How dare China have a presence in the South China Sea, right? While we're at it, the Persians should get the hell out of the Persian Gulf. The truth is, the accusation about intellectual property theft is part of America's defense strategy. A recent paper for the Pentagon said the US, quote, should advocate for aggressive protection of US technology intellectual property rights in an effort to slow down China's telecommunications ecosystem expansion. That's why you keep hearing
forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft. Chinese security agencies have masterminded the wholesale theft of American technology.
The US's own research contradicts this claim. A 2018 US Chamber of Commerce study found that, unlike many of its peers in the developing world, China is making concrete progress in building a 21st century national intellectual property environment. What's really happening is China's own industries are powerful enough that they're starting to challenge their foreign Western counterparts. So the US is whining about the big, bad, menacing Chinese Yellow Peril, because China may have pulled ahead of American tech giants in wireless technology. China is also starting to create new financial infrastructure to get around the US dollar, the world reserve currency. In other words, China is creating mechanisms that can undermine the US government's traditional methods of control and coercion. That's a big no-no. The US won't tolerate this sort of challenge to its economic dominance, which is why you see such a unified bipartisan front against China, with some Democrats trying to out-hawk Trump. Elizabeth Warren, a progressive icon, has repeatedly accused China of weaponizing its economy. And then you've got messaging like this from Democratic presidential candidate Seth Moulton.
We absolutely need to get tough with China. And it's not just on trade. It's the rising threat that China is to our national security.
This aggressive rhetoric has real-life consequences. The US government is purging ethnic Chinese scientists, including US citizens who are doing cancer research at top institutions. FBI agents are reading private emails, stopping Chinese scientists at airports, and visiting people's homes to ask about their loyalty. Trump has even complained that almost every student that comes over to this country from China is a spy. An FBI counterintelligence official warned that these spies could be anyone from students, visiting professors, your neighbors, your colleagues, or someone sharing a soccer field with you. Be very afraid of the Chinese spies under your bed. Anti-Asian sentiments are almost as American as baseball and enslaving black people. Let's not forget the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that prohibited Chinese immigration. So how did we get here? In 1978, China opened up its economy and dealt with the West. It was part of a strategy by Nixon to contain the Soviet Union by making peace and allying with China. Liberals thought China would change to be like the US because of economic advances, that capitalism would make it liberal and democratic, while the right thought China would fail because it was communist. Both were wrong. China was able to advance using capitalism without changing its political system, as the West had hoped. Initially, the US wasn't threatened because they didn't think China could possibly compete, and the West had all the monopolies and set the standards. The big tech powers have traditionally been Western countries that control the developing world. China is breaking out of that mold. It was pummeled by the Europeans in the Opium Wars and suffered under imperialist Japan, but they ultimately escaped colonialism and developed on their own terms. And they developed in a way that makes them critical to the world economy, particularly manufacturing. This insulates them from US attempts to hurt them economically. China presents a model of economic independence instead of devastating neoliberalism for the developing world. That makes them a big threat. And so the US empire is searching for ways to contain China's rise, even contemplating war. US attempts to contain China are actually pushing China closer to other US adversaries. China and Russia have formed a strong partnership in reaction to this US bullying, a partnership that otherwise might not be. And China has played a key role in the UN, preventing American regime change schemes in Syria. China is also looking at reconstructing Syria as the US is still trying to destroy it. All of this raises the question, if China really is such a threat, then why is there such a gap between the nature of US-China competition and the US domestic policy response, which has been to downgrade science and math, cut funding for schools, curtail immigration, and eject foreign scientists? Maybe instead of starting a war, try educating the younger generation to compete on a level playing field that doesn't leave them crushed under the weight of college debt and unaffordable healthcare and rising rents, while paying for endless wars that make the world worse for everyone. Because with every Cold War comes a likelihood of a hot war. In the case of China and the US, that would be disastrous and end with piles and piles of corpses. And for what? To maintain Google's dominance over technology? Hard pass.